The following story was taken from a book written by author Harold Dellinger on the famed outlaw Jesse James, called Jesse James, The Best Writings on the Notorious Outlaw and His Gang, which was published in 2007. This story was created with the permission of the late Harold Dellinger's family and was edited by G.C. Stevens of the Central States Lawmen and Outlaws Historic Association. Frontier Dust by John Lord, 1926. I went at the request of a neighbor as trailman to help him deliver 3,600 head of cattle he had sold. When I got to his camp, I met the Thompson brothers. I thought I had never met two politer, pleasanter men. They received the cattle without a word of dispute as to ages or conditions. They paid for them with ready cash. They had it with them. They drove the cattle into extreme southwestern New Mexico, an entirely unoccupied territory. They were there for about a year and a half, unmolested, when the Mexican ladrones made a raid across the Rio Grande and drove off a bunch of beef steers. The Thompsons' cowboys discovered the trail while it was still fresh, and the two Thompsons and their 5 cowboys followed it across the Rio Grande. The ladrones were regular cattle thieves who made a business of stealing cattle on both sides of the river and driving them to the mining camp in the Sierra Madres in the interior of Mexico and selling them for beef. After crossing back into Mexico, the ladrones picked up some Mexican cattle and were driving them along. The Thompson crowd overtook them before they got far from the river, and they put up a fight. There were 10 of the ladrones and 7 of the Thompson crowd, and they were all gun artists. They killed 3 of the Mexicans, and the balance made a good getaway. The Thompsons took all the cattle and started back for the Rio Grande. They had to camp one night before crossing the river, and they stopped at a ranch where they could get a corral for the cattle. The Mexicans happened to be having a dance that night, and the gringos were asked to join in the dance. Mezcal was plentiful. The Thompsons didn't drink at all, but some of their men did. It wasn't long until some of the crowd were pretty well tanked up, and when a man gets himself outside of enough mezcal, he is ready to fight his grandmother's shadow or get up at 2 o'clock in the morning to pick his own pockets. Some of the gringos paid too much attention to some of the señoritas, and the girls seemed to enjoy it too much to suit the greasers, until one of the greasers called down a gringo with a 6-shooter. There were plenty ready to join in on both sides, so it soon became quite a pistol battle. The Mexicans got the worst of it. They stirred up trouble with the wrong bunch of Americans. There were 2 Mexicans dead and 4 badly wounded, and only 2 Americans slightly wounded. The Thompsons got out and drove to the Rio Grande as fast as they could make those cattle travel. They crossed the river without stopping to cut out the Mexican cattle and leave them behind. The Mexicans' cowboys soon discovered the trail crossing the river into the United States. The Thompsons did not mean to steal the Mexican cattle. They were in a hurry to get out of Mexico. When the Mexican owners learned that some of their cattle had been driven into the United States by Americans, and in so doing, they had killed several citizens of Mexico and wounded several others, they took the matter up with our government without going to the trouble to learn the facts of the case, and charged the Thompsons with stealing cattle and killing Mexicans. Our government sent a deputy United States Marshal to investigate. This marshal was born and raised in Independence, Missouri, and when he got to the Thompson brothers' ranch, he found 2 of his old schoolfellows, Frank and Jesse James. They were the Thompson brothers. Frank and Jesse didn't do a thing that night, but saddle up their 2 best horses and light out for parts unknown to the authorities. On investigation, it was found that the Mexicans were at fault, and the matter was dropped. The James boys left everything in charge of their foreman, and the public heard no more of them for over a year. In the meantime, the big silver boom at Leadville was at its highest, and I had gone there. One day after dinner, I started for South Park to look after some freight teams I had on the road. I had to go south 4 miles to Malta, a stage station on the Arkansas River. There the road turned east down the river and crossed the Weston Range out into South Park. This was the only stage road into Leadville, and there were 75 to 86 horse Concord stages each way every day, and oftentimes 25 or 30 of them would be traveling one right behind another. I got about halfway to Malta when I saw 2 men coming to meet me. I said to myself, if those aren't the Thompson brothers, I am badly fooled. I was doing some fast thinking about them as to what they were up to and what it was best for me to do. I knew then all about who the Thompson brothers were. I was sure they were up to some mischief and didn't want to be recognized by me or anyone else. I knew I didn't want to be recognized by them, as I had no time to spend with the James boys. I expected to meet my teams that evening and ride back into Leadville early the next morning. So I made up my mind to do some acting and pretend I didn't know them, and perhaps they wouldn't know me, as I was dressed as a cattleman when they saw me at the Chisholm's camp, and now I was dressed as a miner. So I assumed the most innocent look I was capable of. When we met, they said, "How do you do, sir?" I said, "How are you, gentlemen?" They asked me if I was in business in the camp. I said I was. They said they wanted to go into some business, not mining, as they didn't know anything about mining. They said they thought almost any business would pay where there was so much money in circulation, as they had been told was in Leadville. While we were talking, several stages passed, all heavily loaded with passengers, as all stages were, going in. They gave each other looks as the stages went by that made me suspicious that they might be figuring on the stages. They also gave each other looks that told me they knew me and thought I didn't know them. We talked about 10 minutes and each went our way. I expected to meet my wagons at the east foot of Weston Range. I found them a day's drive beyond that place. The next morning, as we were about ready to pull out of camp, the first stage passed coming out from Leadville. A man threw us a paper. Everyone on the stage was yelling, "The James boys robbed 24 stages yesterday, halfway between Leadville and Malta." There is where Jesse said, "Keep your purse, lady. We are the James boys. We don't rob ladies." They didn't touch the mail and took no gold or silver and had all the money they could carry. I rode back to Leadville that morning and was shown where they robbed the stages. It was about 150 yards south of where I met them, at a place where there were big rocks on each side of the road. No chance for a team to drive out and pass another. Frank took care of the driver of the first stage. That stopped and held all the balance until Jesse finished the job. They went from there to their camp in the Monte Cristo Mountains, 16 miles south of Malta, where they had several men and extra horses. Where they went from there, the Lord only knows. All manner of deputy officers and posses scoured the surrounding mountains for days and found no trace of them except the location of their camp. The public heard no more of the James boys until Bob Ford killed Jesse and Frank surrendered under an agreement with the governor of Missouri, a year or more after Bob Ford was killed. I was in Trinidad, Colorado, when I met Jim Red, a cattleman whose home was in Independence, Missouri. He said he had a friend who was starting a horse ranch in the Ozark Mountains in southwest Missouri, and he wanted 300 head of 2-year-old draft fillies. "I am going home," he said, "and if you will come, I am sure you can sell them to him." I went. We got to Independence at night. The next morning, Red came to my hotel and told me his friend was out of town, would be home that evening late. We were walking up the main business street when Red asked me if I knew that man sitting on that box, some distance from us. I said, "No." Just then the man got up. I said, "That is Frank James." He stepped in a cigar store and got a cigar, came out and sat down on the same box. Red said, "Don't say anything and see if he will recognize you." When we got about 15 feet from him, he threw up his head and looked at us, saying, "Hello, Lord, where did you come from? Do you know where I saw you last?" I said, "I know where I saw you first and last." He laughed and said, "Young man, you missed your calling. You should be on the stage. You are the best actor I ever saw. You are the only living man who completely fooled the James boys, and such a handshake I never had before or since." We spent the day and night together until 2 o'clock next morning. He told me they didn't follow the business they did because they liked it, that they detested it. When the Civil War closed, on account of their being in Quantrill's raid on Lawrence, Kansas, the United States government put a price on their heads, and to come in and surrender was simply sticking their heads into a halter, and they weren't built that way. So they made up their minds to play a game of sell out, and were obliged to do all this robbing to get money to hire people to hide them and lie for them. That was why the officers could never catch them. I sold Red's friend 17 carloads of mares and went home.